I invited Dr. Bill Sachs. He's a retired physics professor and a radiologist who also worked as a medical officer at the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health. He, along with Gregory Meyerson, an English professor at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, are co-authors of a forthcoming book titled Dyseconomies of Scale, semicolon, Capitalism, the Green New Deal, and the Nuclear Power. Okay, Bill, yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm not going to spend any time on nuclear in this audience. I'm going to spend my time talking about wind and solar because there is a plan afoot to provide all energy with wind and solar, and many of the public figures have endorsed it, and they do not realize what's involved. First of all, getting to very basic notions. As we all know, it takes energy to get energy. Our previous speakers have mentioned this. But more precisely, it takes energy to turn it into useful forms. For example, our cellular metabolism turns food and oxygen into useful energy, and the conversion device is the cell in our bodies. It comes to us free at birth. But it takes muscular energy to import food, that is through hunting or gathering and eating, and to import oxygen, that is breathing, even though that's automatic. Hunting and gathering, let's see, agriculture and animal husbandry takes human and animal muscle and sunlight. Sunlight comes to us free and is converted without further human effort into photosynthesis and plant growth, and animals as well as humans eat the plants or eat other animals to gain muscle. Wind energy and solar energy both come to us free, but it takes windmills, sails, turbines, as well as agriculture, mirrors, and PV panels to capture this energy and convert it into useful forms. In short, it's the conversion devices, stupid. We consider three major sources of energy for social use in our book. First, wind and solar, so-called renewables. Things like hydro and so on are part of this, but they're a minor part. And they are not projected to expand. They are being contracted in the US, and they have all kinds of problems. Second, fossil fuels. And third, nuclear. We're not going to deal much with biofuels, biomass, because they're deadly. They're far from carbon neutral over time scales less than a generation, so we don't deal with them at all either very much. So we have wind and solar, fossil fuels, and nuclear are the three leading contenders. The concept of green energy, as opposed to carbon-based energy, is avoidance of global warming and pollution, that is, respiratory illnesses. Wind and solar are attractive to many people because of failure to consider the conversion devices and all that goes with them, and they are repelled by nuclear, and in both cases, the attraction and the repulsion are based on misunderstandings due to deliberate disinformation and conveyed misinformation based on that. So first and foremost, as I said, the proponents of renewables ignore the conversion devices and all the energy that goes into manufacturing them, installing them, operating, maintaining, decommissioning, replacing, and expanding them to meet human needs. These elements are expressed concisely in a concept that Luke has referred to, namely EROI, that's energy returned over energy invested. Sometimes it's EROEI, but we use EROI for short. That is the mathematical expression of efficiency. Efficiency is the amount of output for the amount of input. We focus on the efficiency of the production of energy rather than on the consumption. One of the major advocacies is for more efficient consumption devices, that is, appliances, better gas mileage for cars and so on. This is not what we're interested in. We're interested in the efficiency on the production side, the production of energy. The inputs for the conversion devices are much greater for wind and solar. There's more material resources. There are rare earth materials and so on. There's much greater land required to capture the rarefied, diffuse wind and sunlight. It takes much more time to manufacture and install these farms. The labor is diverted from other tasks, and they require reliable baseload backup because of the intermittency. And that now comes from either fossil fuels, mainly natural gas, or also from nuclear. And advocates of all renewables, they look to excess capacity or storage to compensate for intermittency. And as we show, neither of these can do the trick completely. They both require external baseload from either fossils or nuclear, and they both increase the EI, that is the energy invested, tremendously, and thereby decrease the EROI because EI is the denominator. In short, the more wind and solar that is installed, the greater the need for fossil fuels or nuclear, not lesser need, and that is not part of the account of the renewables advocates. The great escape from fossil fuels is a pipeline dream of renewables advocates. All attempts to do so lower EROI, often below acceptability. EROI is ER over EI, and if you look at the ER, the energy return, it has two components. EN, that is the net energy to run the society, and the EI, that is the energy invested to get that energy. The net energy for society goes to power such things as transportation, heating, manufacturing, desalinization, shelter, food gathering, cooking, science, education, health, entertainment, art, aesthetics, leisure, stress relief, and much more. EN is what matters. That's where our attention has to be focused, less on the ER, but on the EN. A paper by Weisbach et al. In 2013 in the journal Energy gave figures for Germany for the EROI for different energy sources. Their solar PV had an EROI of 4, and if they considered storage, it reduced it to 2. Biomass was 4, wind was 16, but with the storage was reduced to 4. Solar CSP, that is mirrors and pipes holding a fluid that retains the heat, was 19, and with storage was reduced to 9. Gas combined cycle was 28, coal 30, hydro 49, with storage 35, and nuclear 75, which is a gross underestimate. The generation 3 and 4 go up not only well beyond 75, but actually go up into the hundreds and possibly thousands. And here is a little-known fact that has been demonstrated. It's generally accepted that a society requires energy sources with an EROI of at least 7 to provide the net energy to run the society. Wind and solar, as we see above, average about 3, somewhere between 2 and 4 with storage. Let's look at this on the diagram. The ER is above the line, EI is below, and the ratio is about 3 to 1 as I've drawn it. And note that the ER above the line is made up of EN plus EI. The EI above the line is the energy necessary for the next cycle to generate the next cycle of EN plus EI. Now here's the comparison. If we hold the EN, which is the point of all energy production, as Luke was saying, the net energy to run the society. Otherwise, we don't generate energy just for the sake of generating energy. We do it to run a society. And if we hold it constant for the three sources, wind and solar in the first diagram, fossil fuels in the second, and nuclear in the third, and note the EROI, as I've drawn somewhat to scale, you can see that for a given amount of net societal energy, the required energy input for wind and solar is huge compared to that for fossil fuels and nuclear. It almost disappears for nuclear. So this roughly will track costs. I'm not talking about money in this when we're talking about the economics. I'm going to talk about the energy cost. But that roughly tracks monetary cost. So for the same EN, wind and solar requires about 10 times as much EI as fossil fuels. That was 30 to 3. 33 times as much EI as nuclear. That was about 100 to 3, and much more for later generation nuclear. So the cost for wind and solar is huge compared to fossils and nuclear, particularly nuclear. Weisbach's EROI estimates, and this is a very important point, includes the additional expenditure for storage and the shorter lifetime of wind turbines, which are about 20 to 30 years, and solar PV panels, which range from 10 to 30 years, and hence they require more frequent replacement. Storage helps smooth over the inherent intermittency of wind and solar by reducing the number of outages, but storage fails to eliminate all outages. In particular, Weisbach et al. Based their estimates for those EROIs on the average annual capacity factor of a wind or solar farm. Capacity factor, let's talk about this for a second. That's the ratio of the actual energy obtained over a certain time interval from a conversion device or a whole farm or the whole system to the maximum capacity of the conversion device or farm, which is also known as its nameplate capacity. The nameplate depends on the local climate conditions for wind and solar, but it doesn't depend on those for fossils or nuclear, mostly because wind and solar have to be out in the elements and exposed to nature's roughness, whereas fossil fuel plants and nuclear plants are all internalized in buildings. For wind turbines, the optimum is about 30 to 50%. That's the capacity factor for an annual average. And for solar PV panels, it's about 15 to 30%. But these are average annual values, and this becomes extremely important. For nuclear, as we all know, it's well over 90%, and that depends on maintenance schedules rather than on nature's whims. That is, we have some control over the capacity factor for nuclear and indeed for fossils. This is a diagram. Bill showed some diagrams similar to this. This was German's wind in 2014. This has been shown in a number of places. This installed nameplate capacity is the red line at the top. The dark blue spikes are the actual delivered wind energy over the course of the entire year. That shows all 12 months, and it's broken up into the weeks, but it obviously is highly variable. It's not called VRE for no reason at all. Now, the average over a long time interval, such as a year, is one thing, but the average over shorter time intervals fluctuates wildly. This is a graph that presents it in a somewhat different way. If the capacity factor were, say, 0.3 on average, from year to year, it wouldn't vary all that much. Year is a long averaging time. If you try to look over the course of a day, that is the capacity factor day by day, it would vary quite a bit more, even though it's centered still on 0.3. If you look per second, the capacity factor varies so wildly that much of the time it actually includes 0. And this is where you get energy outages. The All Renewables Plan by Jacobson et al., which is a very famous one they call the roadmap to getting rid of everything except for wind and solar, including the complete elimination of fossil fuels, which we applaud, and the complete elimination of nuclear, which is not possible, as it turns out, ignores the variation in CF. They pay attention solely to the long interval averages, that is, the annual averages. They plan to compensate for the intermittency through excess capacity, and for some reason, Jacobson et al. Shunned storage. Excess capacity uses a lot more land, still more materials, still more labor, still more time, and most importantly, still more input energy, and it magnifies the EI for the same EN, net energy. Storage likewise uses still more EI, both to build the storage apparatus and to cover the losses that are inherent in the very act of storing and releasing where needed. There are always energy losses in both directions. Both, therefore, lower EROI even more. Jacobson aims at obtaining the actual energy output that the nameplate is, and he does it by increasing the size of the farms. That is, if the CF annually averaged is, say, 0.3, they plan to attain the desired nameplate by increasing the size or number of wind and solar farms by a factor of 1 over that 0.3, or by a factor of 3.3. They're going to make these farms huge, in other words. But they ignore the departures from annual averages on shorter time scales, so they ignore the inevitable episodic outages. Outages are intolerable in an intensely electrified environment. For example, computers crash. Suppose you're in an underground subway that's run by electricity, and you're in a tunnel and the electricity goes out. There's darkness, the passengers are trapped. In order to escape, they have to walk along the tracks. The third rail might come on any time. If there is a surgery going on in a hospital and there's a bleeder, the surgeon is trying to control through cautery, and the electricity goes out, and there's a little delay in bringing up the support generator for the hospital. The patient could bleed to death, and so on. Their outages are intolerable. Outages cause outrage. Storage can't solve this problem because there's no way for finite storage to cover all possible durations of wind and solar absences in all climates. Episodic outages may be made rarer by storage, but they are inevitable. All attempts to completely avoid outages are futile, and they merely amplify materials, land, labor, and energy virtually without limit, thus lowering EROI below 1 and eradicating net energy altogether. In summary, wind and solar are characterized by low energy density, that is more material, low power density, that is more land, uncontrollable intermittency, unavoidable episodic blackouts, rapid obsolescence, unsustainability, and unexpandability. And let's talk about these last two in a little more detail in a minute. Given the rapid obsolescence of wind turbines and solar panels, they have to be replaced more often. As I said, turbines last about 20 to 30 years, and PV panels about 10 to 30 years. Fossil plants about 60 to 70, and nuclear plants 80 to 100 years, and possibly longer. The shorter the lifetimes of conversion devices for an entire all-renewable system, the greater the energy input per unit time. The energy to replace a single obsolescent device will, on average, and this is a key point, have to come from the device itself, since by the Green New Deal plan that the Democrats have touted, fossils and nuclear will no longer exist as a source. If each device cannot generate enough energy to replace itself, the number of devices will necessarily decline until the system exhausts itself and collapses. Let's show this diagrammatically. These three are going to be taken one at a time in the next three slides. I just want to focus your attention on the white area, which is the energy needed to replace itself. I've drawn three different possibilities, each one taking more out of, diverting more energy out of the net energy in order to shorten the time it takes. So let's take the first one. There's a trade-off between the diversion of power from net energy and the time it takes to generate enough energy to replace itself. It must be able to replace itself or it will be unsustainable. If it takes more than one device to replace one device, as you can see, the number will fade over time and disappear. Let's look at one now. We've increased the borrowing or the stealing, the theft of net energy to run the society in order to shorten the time it takes to generate the energy to replace itself. And finally, we get it within the lifetime so that we can generate the replacement energy before the device becomes totally obsolescent. But look what has happened to the net energy. Now, contrast this with fossils or nuclear. Much wider because the lifetime is much wider. The power is the EI, the operation and maintenance input energy is much lower, the net energy is much greater, and the white area, the energy to replace, is much less. And in this diagram, I've shown about 3.5 such units, so that this one device or set of plants can not only replace itself, but can expand. Each one can store enough energy to replace 3.5 of itself. So here are the conclusions. Fossil and nuclear devices leave far more net energy for a given EI, and they can replace themselves several times over. Therefore, they are sustainable and expandable as human needs expand, though fossils, of course, have to be eliminated for other reasons, namely the respiratory pollution and the main cause today of global warming. In contrast, an all-wind and solar system can barely sustain or reproduce itself while providing any level of EN, net energy, let alone expand itself. In any case, the net energy, which is the goal of any energy system, is too low to sustain an all-wind and solar energy system, let alone sustain a society. Therefore, an all-renewable system will collapse. But long before that, the effort to build an all-renewable system would be halted. The only reason wind and solar farms can currently expand is that they rely on the continued presence of fossils and nuclear to build them. It's fossils and nuclear that supply the energy to build wind and solar farms. If we eliminate fossils and nuclear, as is Jacobson's plan and that of many of his followers and admirers, wind and solar will eliminate themselves. Since fossils have to be eliminated for other reasons, and since all wind and solar systems necessarily collapse of their own shortcomings, there is only one source of energy that can and therefore should run the world's energy needs. Now, just to comment on Bill's advocacy of there being a place for wind and solar to supplement nuclear, one can see maybe temporarily places that are somewhat isolated where wind and solar might be of some use, but there is nothing that can't be done by nuclear, with the right conversions and so on. And since wind and solar will only act to lower the net energy that can be produced if they are part of the mix, there is no reason eventually to have any wind and solar, and nuclear energy is the only way that the Earth can run itself sustainably and be able to expand for society's expanding needs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bill. It was very interesting presentation.